Welcome, everyone. I'm Dr. Samantha Bates, and I'll be your guide today for this training on promoting positive behavior and engagement through sport. This session is part of the Coach Beyond initiative, a partnership between Life Sports at The Ohio State University and the Ohio High School Athletic Association. This training is meant to serve as an option for your school or district to meet the requirement for training on positive behavioral interventions and supports, also known as PBIS. You will need to submit your certificate to your school or district to receive credit for this training, and it will be depending on their approval as to whether it is accepted. Please be aware there will be a brief knowledge check at the end of this training, so listen carefully and let's get ready to coach beyond. First, I'm going to start with our learning objectives or game plan, which includes these 4 key objectives. First, we're going to increase your knowledge of the Ohio Administrative Code for PBIS and really focus on what it means to address this area of restraint and seclusion. We're also going to provide some knowledge of the underlying causes of behaviors, as well as help you think about strategies to promote positive behaviors and also reduce negative punishment practices. We'll explore each of these areas, and by the end of the session, hopefully you'll have reflected and also thought about actionable ways you can improve your coaching and support your athletes and teams. Let's kick off with Ohio's policy on PBIS. So this policy is designed to help create safe and supportive environments for students and also to reduce the need for emergency or negative interventions. The first part of this policy really focuses on the fact that all K through 12 public schools in Ohio need to implement PBIS. PBIS is a proactive framework that's designed to define, teach, and support positive student behaviors. It's structured in 3 tiers, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But essentially, this is really designed to think about what are different students' needs and how can we support them in a proactive way. The second part of this policy really focuses on restraint and seclusion. And here's what's most important for you to know. Restraint and seclusion are only permitted in emergency situations when there is an imminent risk of harm to students or others, perhaps including school staff, and other interventions have also failed. Restraint or seclusion cannot be used for punishment, discipline, or simply out of convenience. Specific restrictions include prohibiting the use of prone restraints, which is really called face down restraints, and using seclusion in locked spaces. If, as a last resort, seclusion is needed, continuous adult supervision is always required, and the space must meet safety and dignity standards as outlined in this Ohio policy. The next element of this policy is that school districts must provide training on PBIS every 3 years to all personnel who interact with students. So that's why you're here as a coach. Also, annual training is also required on things like crisis management, de-escalation techniques, which are actually a great way to help a student calm down and address behavior, and the safe use of physical restraint and seclusion. So again, in many schools, these trainings are provided every 3 years, and this ensures that staff are prepared to manage emergencies appropriately. So they want you as coaches to also have this knowledge. Really important also is the 4th element of this policy. If restraint or seclusion is used in any instance, parents must be informed immediately and receive a written report within 24 hours. If a student experiences 3 or more incidents of restraint or seclusion in a school year, the school is required to meet and go over with the parents what's called a functional behavioral assessment, or an FBA, or relook at the student's behavioral intervention plan. This may be their what's called BIP, Behavior Intervention Plan, or perhaps their IEP, their Individualized Education Plan. This policy is intended to minimize the need for restraint and seclusion and instead promote positive behaviors, ensuring that we only go to these practices when it's an emergency and absolutely necessary. After this training, we've included a handout in your course content for you to review on this PBIS policy. Next up, we want to give you some background on what PBIS is. PBIS stands for Positive Behavioral Interventions and Supports. Again, it's a framework based on a 3-tiered approach. Tier 1 exists at the base of the triangle, consists of practices like those that reach an entire school, or for you in sport, your entire team, your players, your coaches, parents, and support staffs. Tier 1 level practices establish a foundation for what is expected, positive and proactive supports that can prevent unwanted behaviors and promote positive behaviors. Tier 2 and 3 interventions are more for students or athletes who have higher levels of need. So, Tier 2 level may look like players who are demonstrating challenging behaviors. Perhaps these are those who have a history of trauma, are struggling academically, and need to go to a group um, study hall to be able to improve. Maybe those who also are challenged by some negative interactions with parents and families. And so one of the steps you might take is to have that student ride with another student's family. Tier 2 is really thinking about the next level of need in small groups. How can you support that student athlete? And again, in schools, these often look like targeted, group, individualized interventions that can support students with higher levels of need. At the third tier, these are your players that are maybe most in need. Perhaps they are seeing a counselor or social worker at your school, and they need more intensive individualized support that really keeps them at the center of planning and making sure they're successful in different spaces. Sometimes this might also look like players who are receiving special education services through things like IEPs or 504 plans. They may also be struggling with things like depression, mental health diagnosis, or other disabilities. These students often are those you want to refer and connect with the school counselors, social workers, administrators, your athletic director to better understand their needs and how they can be successful in school and sport. These concepts can be directly related to sport. So when we think about the tier 1 level, often in schools, many schools have 3 to 5 kind of sayings that set the expectation for how you're supposed to behave at school. And these are often our values and kind of norms that we set in sport. So, for example, at the tier 1 level as a coach, I might have positive behavior expectations, such as we're going to act respectfully, be punctual, and always demonstrate teamwork. These 3 things can help me establish a strong culture for my team. I can define these, I can use them as accountability structures. I can also call them out when I see them and provide praise around this. So, for example, let's say I have a team value around respect. You would not only expect players to respect the referees during the game, but you would also expect them to respect their teammates, their teachers, and their coaches. Take a minute and think about the behavioral expectations you talk with your team about. You could struggle with, say, things like getting players to show up on time for practice. How might you build in an expectation early on in the season or currently now in the season to make sure that you're being proactive and there are positive reinforcements as well as some, consequences for understanding that these are our team norms. Next up, we're going to talk about what's called the ABCs, and we're getting ready to go on a race and drive here in a moment. So this is some of your pre-race preparation. So the ABC model really stands for antecedent, behavior, and consequence. And what's important here is to think about the different ways that we see student athletes behave. So for example, I might see a student athlete miss a free throw. Well, after missing a free throw, they end up putting their head down and fouling another player. What happens as a result of that is they continue to do that behavior, and the consequence is they fell out of the game. So we see that we have a young person who is communicating frustration. Instead, they're acting out, and we're seeing that these behaviors have negative consequences for the student athlete. So it's really important when you're having a student athlete with a challenging behavior to think about this ABC model. What's happening before that I might be able to have a conversation with them around and intervene so that I decrease the frequency of the behavior and also remove this negative consequence or potentially something that's harmful to the student athlete. What's important is behaviors usually fill one of these 4 functions. They can be one or multiple of these, but we often see negative behaviors show up because a student wants to escape something, maybe end or avoid it, get attention by gaining approval or recognition. They want to gain something tangible like a award or an experience. Or lastly, they need some type of sensory need. Perhaps it's food or physical pleasure or relief from something that doesn't feel good. And what happens is we see consequences or responses to some of these behaviors. There's 2 types of consequences that exist. Reinforcers, which actually increase the behavior and follow often as punishers. Whereas we also see things like negative consequences, like punishments. So there are kind of two different ways we're going to talk about this here. So let's go ahead and drive together. The first thing I want to talk about here is defining behavioral expectations. As a coach, you should always define positive behavioral expectations and make sure you have reinforcements that align with these different expectations. For example, many coaches say participate, be on time, be respectful, be responsible. These expectations should be developmentally appropriate for the age of the kids you are working with. You could also align them with whatever your school's behavioral expectations are, but you want to be sure to have a conversation and explicitly teach the different behaviors. Examples could be things like how to be respectful means respecting the decisions of authority figures, such as officials. This could also be shaking your opponent's hand after a match, or let's take a knee for an injured player. All of these reinforce your norm around what it means to be respectful. Make sure to frame your behavioral expectations as things that you want to see. Also, these can be posted in places such as locker rooms. They can be put on wristbands or t-shirts, and they should also be talked about in or used in pre and post training chants, debriefs of games. Always building in these expectations can help your student athletes be more successful in engaging in the positive behaviors we want to see and avoiding negative behaviors. Next up, we want to make sure we reward the positive behaviors when we see our players meet our expectations. Now, this may sound silly to say, well, I'm coaching high schoolers and I'm not going to praise them for being on time. However, if that's one of your expectations, peer modeling and watching others receive praise for something that is a positive expectation can actually increase the behaviors of other peers around them. So coaches can use different techniques to reward players as to what is expected. They might give them some type of tangible reward. They might give them verbal praise. What is most important here is the proximity of the praise. Positive behavior should be rewarded immediately or as close to when the behavior happened as possible. If you wait too long, the connection between the behavior and the reinforcement is not as meaningful and important. A shorter time between the behavior and the positive reinforcement can actually make that connection stronger. Rewards and praise should also only be given when players meet expectations. If coaches reward behaviors that aren't congruent with what you've set out at the beginning of the season or the school year, the rewards and praise lose their weight and the expectations become really less clear. So let's talk about one that we see for Ohio State. You've all seen the Buckeye helmets, but do you actually know what they mean? So in 1968, trainer Ernie Briggs conceived this idea of awarding players helmet stickers resembling Buckeye leaves for motivational purposes. Basically, there was a reward for players provided for good behaviors. This tradition has now stuck for 54 years, with only some minor changes over the years. Jim Tressel took more of a teamwork approach over an individual-based reward system. So essentially, every time he saw elements of teamwork, these Buckeye leaves were rewarded and given out and put on people's helmets. Others were awarded for wins or more individual praise. For example, a defensive player perhaps having so many sacks. Others were provided for different levels of the team. So for example, the defense racking up at least 5 3-and-outs. All these different things were used to reinforce both sport performance, but you can see where Jim Tressel took it into a more life and social skills element. Although the Buckeye Leaf stickers reward players for specific performance behaviors, systems like this can really be effective. Maybe you do a golden boot for a student who scores the most goals, but there might also be another incentive for a student who cheers on teammates, shows up at time, engages in the warm-ups, respects officials. How can you make your rewards for positive behaviors applicable to things that are happening both on and off the field? All right, so an example from life sports is really important. We actually have small little buttons that we give to young people who participate in our camps, and we have 4 behavioral expectations. So these actually come out to be SETs, S-E-T-S, which stands for self-control, effort, teamwork, and social responsibility. Every time that we see a young person engaging in something positive, self-control, managing their emotions after losing a game, they often can receive a button. What's fascinating is that we found that kids take a lot of pride in putting these on their backpacks, their shirts when coming to camp. And the verbal reinforcement and the value placed on getting these little buttons that also mirror a Buckeye leaf, much like what we see on the helmet here, can actually increase the prevalence of seeing positive behaviors. So it's important to consider the value, meaningfulness, and kind of how you reinforce the things you want to see among your student athletes. All right, so let's talk about some red flags. We really want to get out of this negative punishment system around sport. So I was a student athlete and I can remember having to run after doing something negative. And I will be honest, I still go on a run today and think about how sometimes this was associated with such a negative connotation in my life. A lot of research studies show that when coaches use improper reinforcements or consequences, we can actually make sport less engaging, mitigate or decrease the opportunities for kids to be physically active in the future. And so we want to make sure that we reduce negative punishments. All right. Instead, what we'd like to do is use some of these terms. Perhaps a positive reinforcement, a reward for an athlete for performing the correct or desired behavior. Also, praise can go a long way. Using specific, valuable feedback with the player about what they're doing well can often increase the positive behaviors as well. A negative reinforcement is also removing something undesirable to reinforce the desired behavior. So, for example, let's say we had a really great game. We demonstrated respect with the officials. We've been showing up to practices on time. I might take away a conditioning workout, and that's a negative reinforcement. I'm actually removing something that's kind of undesirable and complementing the behaviors that I want to see. Okay, so those are some things we can think about as coaches that can help us sort of increase the number of positive reinforcements we're doing in sport to help our behaviors be more successful. What we want to do, though, is also decrease this idea of punishment. So, in response to an undesired behavior, this is making players run if they lose a game or do push ups or if they aren't listening. Punishment is usually given in an unpredictable and irrational manner, and sometimes it's because us as coaches have sort of lost control of the situation. Instead, coaches should try to use reinforcements, mainly positive ones, to help shape behaviors and also own on days when they are struggling to understand what's going on with the team, that they're getting frustrated. That will be more meaningful and valuable than sometimes this punishment approach. The best practice around reinforcements is 4 to 1. So we also might give praise. Hey, you're doing this and this really well. And we might give a critical or negative feedback and remark to an athlete at a rate of 4 to 1. When we're working at life sports with kids who've experienced high levels of trauma and also tend to hear fewer positive reinforcements in their schools, perhaps in their communities, we use a ratio of 10 to 1. So trying to praise, reinforce behaviors, give positive and congruent feedback when we see what we want to see, immediately jumping on that and providing the athlete with something positive that they can continue to do in the future. All right, so moving on, we're going to talk about feedback. All right, so feedback is really important as praise is not always enough to sustain a desired behavior. We actually also have to give players honest and open feedback. Feedback increases the likelihood that players will recognize skills in the future and also think about ways to reduce needs for correction. It can also help us enhance our self-control and self-esteem, as well as give us an internal locus of control. So once I receive specific feedback and I change a behavior and the coach provides praise, it builds my self-esteem that I can continue to improve in the future. So to be effective, feedback must be individualized. Our recommendation is to use the student athlete's name. So saying something like, John, you showed great self-control after the penalty call by not arguing with the referees. You also want to be giving specific feedback with details. So explicitly defining what you want to continue using words tied to those behavioral expectations. So instead of saying good job, you could say something like, it was great to see you using both feet as you dribbled. See if you can do it again, going a little bit faster. Also, it can be critical. You can include specific information about how to improve or what they did correctly and how they can continue to get 1% better so they can increase and repeat that behavior. We talked about immediate, making sure that the feedback is given as closely to the behavior as possible to increase the likelihood. We want to do this frequently, and we also want to be really genuine. Eye contact and direct attention with the athlete is important to make feedback successful. As a note, when providing feedback, we want to focus on what we want them to do, not what we don't want them to do. So instead of saying, don't throw trash on the ground, you're going to say something like, place your trash in the trash cans. Instead of stop talking when I'm talking, you're going to say something like, please listen when I am talking. Also, common one, stop goofing around. Instead, I'd like you to say something like, let's stay focused on what we're practicing today. One of our favorite techniques at Life Sports and through Coach Beyond is to teach win. Hey, what's important now? Let's win today. WIN. What's important now? So these are all really important. I want you to think of a moment when you gave a player feedback recently and think about this. Was it individualized? Was it specific? Was it immediate? Are you doing it frequently, perhaps even two at this ratio of 4 to 1? And how genuine are you being? Think about your body language, your eye contact, making sure that we can reinforce those different things we want to see for our student athletes. And then the final lap on our drive is reflecting on the value. So you've set these behavioral expectations, you're providing some type of reward, you're trying to increase the positive reinforcements as well as negative reinforcements. Again, giving those days off or talking with your team about what those could look like. But you also need to engage in some reflection. Does your team value and are they bought into your behavioral expectations? What are their unique motivators? Do you need to change or pivot to make these things more specific and aligned with what they need? So, an important element here is considering intrinsic versus extrinsic rewards. So, intrinsic rewards are internal, they're more about self fulfilling or self satisfying someone's needs. So, an example might be I go to practice, I go to sport because it's fun. I want to improve, I want to be the best I can be. Extrinsic rewards are those driven by external sources, such as I want to get a college scholarship. I don't want to disappoint my parents. I want to get a trophy. What's important here is that we check in with our athletes and try to find a healthy combination of both intrinsic and extrinsic motivations to help them perform at their highest level. Why do they want to be there and keeping them connected to that? And also, again, what could be something as an external goal that they're working toward to help create a common balance and healthy perspective on why they're participating in sport? We also want you to evaluate your system. Is it working? Are you seeing the behaviors you want to see, or are things getting worse? Is it changing behavior when you provide praise? Are you able to get feedback from your athletes? So, one of the most important things we find in sport is that athletes having a voice and being able to provide feedback on the team norms and behavioral expectations can be really important in them actually being successful in seeing those behaviors through. So, you might invite your captains or leaders to meet with you and discuss their thoughts about how things are going about behaviors to see if you need to evaluate, adapt, be flexible, and change how you're doing things. So we'd encourage you to kind of bring all these concepts together, and we use this DRIVE acronym. But coach, if you're sitting there and thinking, all right, I'm checking the box of this training, I would just ask you to go a step further. What are the 3 expectations you're going to implement with your team? When have you talked about those? How are you reinforcing them? Can you think of 2 examples of positive and negative reinforcements that you might implement when you see the behaviors that you want? Can you reflect on the ways you provide feedback to your student athletes? and leave this training with one strategy you might improve on. For me, it's giving kind of immediate feedback. Sometimes I like to reflect and think about the feedback, but then I miss the opportunity to give it in the moment. And then let's think about a way you can evaluate your plan. Did you have athlete voice? Can you think about how they think things are going, and adapt as you continue to grow your team and get better collectively in promoting positive behaviors through sport? So this was our game plan today. We wanted to increase your knowledge of the PBIS policy, also think about ways to promote positive behaviors, reduce punishment, and also empathize that behavior is a form of communication, and we need to be curious over critical when we see a negative behavior and think about the ABCs there. So thank you all for participating today. These are some of our references. I hope that you leave with some tools to help foster positive behaviors in your athletes. Remember, every player and team is unique, so don't be afraid to adapt these strategies to fit your context. And if you have any questions or want to discuss a specific challenge that you're facing, we are available at Coach Beyond at osu.edu. We can come out and speak to teams as well as schools and districts to continue to provide further support around this training. Thanks for being here. We wish you the best of luck in Coaching Beyond.